Sometimes the people we think we know best turn out to be strangers. Sometimes what looks like an ending is really just the beginning of understanding who they truly were. Elise Crane thought her uncle left her an empty ranch in the Montana mountains. Everyone said the land was worthless. The old man died alone with nothing to his name. But on her first morning, she rode into the back pastures and found 200 animals hidden in the foothills. Horses, cattle, mules, all bearing brands from different ranches. Some had been missing for years. Her neighbors started asking hard questions. The sheriff came knocking, and Elise realized her uncle left her more than land. He left her a secret that could ruin everything. Was he a thief or something else entirely? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter from the lawyer arrived on a Tuesday in late March, delivered to Elise Crane's small apartment in Billings, where she'd been living alone for the past 8 months. The envelope was thick, official, and carried news she hadn't expected. Her Uncle Vernon had died, and he'd left her everything. Everything turned out to be an 840-acre ranch in the Montana high country, about 90 miles southwest of where she sat reading the notice. Elise was 37 years old, recently divorced, and working as a veterinary technician at a clinic that primarily treated people's house pets. The divorce had been quiet and sad rather than angry. Just two people realizing they'd built a life neither of them actually wanted. She'd kept her maiden name throughout the marriage, which made the paperwork simpler. Now she lived in a one-bedroom apartment with furniture from her grandmother and drove a truck that needed new brakes. Vernon Crane had been her father's older brother, a man who'd never married and rarely left his property in the mountains near Coldwater. Elise remembered him from her childhood, a tall, weathered man with hands that were gentle with animals and rough from decades of work. After her father died when she was 12, Vernon had stepped in quietly. He'd taught her to ride, to read weather, to understand how animals thought and felt. Those summers at his ranch had been the foundation of everything she knew about livestock and land. But she hadn't seen him in nearly 3 years. Life had gotten complicated with the marriage, the move to Billings, the slow unraveling of what she'd thought was her future. Vernon had called occasionally, but the conversations were brief. He wasn't a man who said much on the telephone. The last time they'd spoken, he'd asked if she was happy. She'd lied and said yes. He'd been quiet for a long moment, then told her she always had a place at the ranch if she needed it. Now he was gone. 72 years old, died of a heart attack in his sleep, according to the lawyer. No funeral because Vernon had specified cremation and no service. His ashes were already scattered on the property he'd worked his entire adult life. The lawyer, a man named Raymond Foster with an office in Coldwater, said Vernon had updated his will 6 months ago. He'd left the ranch, all equipment, and any remaining assets to Elise. His 2 children from a relationship decades ago, children Elise had met only once, received token amounts and personal items. The ranch was hers. She gave her notice at the clinic, packed what mattered into her truck, and drove west on a gray April morning when the mountains were still holding snow at the higher elevations. The land opened up as she left Billings behind. Wide plains, giving way to rolling hills, and eventually to the serious mountains that defined this part of Montana. She stopped for gas in a town called Whitehall, bought coffee and a sandwich she ate while driving, and reached Coldwater just after 2 in the afternoon. Coldwater was the kind of town that existed because ranchers needed some place to buy feed and equipment. Population 847, according to the sign at the town limits, though Elise suspected that number was optimistic. Main Street had a feed store, a diner, a gas station, a bank, and a few other businesses that looked like they'd been there since the 1950s. The lawyer's office was above the bank, accessed by an outside staircase that creaked under her boots. Raymond Foster was in his 60s, wearing a suit that had been expensive 20 years ago. He shook her hand, offered condolences that felt genuine, and spent an hour going through paperwork. The ranch was hers free and clear. Vernon had paid off the mortgage decades ago. There was a small bank account, barely $4,000, and a loan Vernon had taken out 6 months before his death for $32,000. The loan was against the property and payments were due monthly. What did he need the money for? Elise asked. Raymond shook his head. He didn't say. I advised against it at his age, but Vernon was, well, he was a determined man when he'd made up his mind about something. The keys to the ranch house and barn were in a manila envelope, along with a single-page letter in Vernon's handwriting. Raymond handed her everything and stood. I'm sorry for your loss. Vernon was a good man, kept to himself more in recent years, but he was always fair in his dealings. Elise drove the final 12 miles to the ranch with the letter unopened on the seat beside her. The road climbed steadily, following a creek that ran clear and cold from the mountains. Vernon's property started at a cattle guard where a weathered sign read Crane Ranch in letters that needed repainting. She crossed the cattle guard and followed the gravel drive through pastures that showed no sign of livestock. The main house sat in a small valley with mountains rising behind it. It was a single-story structure built from local timber, with a covered porch that faced south and a stone chimney at one end. The roof was metal, rusty in places but intact. The barn stood 50 yards away, larger than the house, with a hayloft and a series of corrals that were empty and showing their age. Everything looked tired and neglected, but not ruined. With work, it could be brought back. She parked and sat for a moment, looking at the place that was now hers. The late afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Wind moved through the grass with a sound like water. She could hear the creek somewhere close by and the call of a hawk circling high overhead. It was the kind of quiet that city people found unsettling, but Elise had grown up with it. This was the silence that let you hear yourself think. The house was unlocked. Vernon had never been one to worry about thieves this far from town. Inside, everything was neat and spare. A main room with a wood stove, a kitchen barely big enough for one person, 2 small bedrooms, and a bathroom with old fixtures that worked when she tested them. Vernon's presence was everywhere, boots by the door, a jacket on a hook, coffee cup rinsed and waiting by the sink. It felt wrong to be here without him, like trespassing. She found his study at the back of the house, a room barely larger than a closet with a desk, a filing cabinet and shelves of books about ranching, animal husbandry and Montana history. On the desk was a leather-bound ledger, the kind used for recording cattle brands and ranch business. She opened it and found page after page of Vernon's careful handwriting. Brands, dates, notes that didn't quite make sense. Circle T, Broken Arrow, Ladder J, Diamond Bar. Brands from ranches she'd heard of, most of them no longer operating. Next to each brand were numbers, sometimes dates, sometimes just question marks. She sat at Vernon's desk as the light faded outside and tried to understand what she was looking at. The entries went back years, some more than a decade. There was no clear pattern, no obvious system. Just brands and notes, careful records of something Vernon had thought important enough to document, but cryptic enough to keep private. When full dark came, she left the study and opened the letter Raymond had given her. Vernon's handwriting was shaky. This had been written near the end. Elise, it read. If you're reading this, then you've come home. I always hoped you would, though I'm sorry it's for this reason. The ranch is yours now, along with everything that comes with it. You'll find things that need explaining, and I'm sorry I'm not there to explain them properly. I did what I thought was right, even when it wasn't legal. I hope you can understand that sometimes mercy looks different than the law. The brand book will help you understand what I've been doing. Take care of them. They deserve better than what they had. I trust you to do what's right. Always have. Uncle Vernon. She read it 3 times, trying to find more meaning in the words. Take care of what? The ranch was empty. She'd driven past every pasture on the way in. No cattle, no horses, nothing but empty grass and fences that needed mending. That night she slept in Vernon's bed because it seemed wrong to use the guest room. She lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle, to the wind in the eaves, to the vast silence of the mountains. Somewhere in that darkness, answers waited. Vernon had left her more than property. He'd left her a mystery, and judging from his letter, a responsibility she didn't yet understand. The next morning she would ride out to survey the land. She would see for herself what state the ranch was in, what needed immediate attention, what could wait. She would try to understand what Vernon had meant about taking care of them. She would begin the work of making this place her own, or at least trying to. But sleep was slow in coming, and when it finally arrived, she dreamed of her uncle riding through mountains she couldn't quite see, leading animals that stayed just beyond the edge of her vision. In the dream, he looked back once, and she understood he was showing her something important. But she woke before she could follow him far enough to understand what it was. Dawn came early and cold. Elise made coffee in Vernon's kitchen using his old percolator, standing at the window, watching light spread across the valley. The mountains caught fire first, peaks glowing pink and gold, while the lower elevations stayed in shadow. It was the kind of morning that made you understand why people chose this life, despite the hardships and isolation. She spent the early hours exploring the immediate grounds. The barn was in better shape than it looked from outside. Sturdy construction, roof solid despite the rust. The stalls were empty but clean, swept recently enough that she wondered if Vernon had been expecting to use them. Tack hung neatly in a side room, saddles oiled and ready, bridles in good repair, equipment that showed care even if it showed age. A workbench held tools organized with the precision of someone who spent a lot of time alone and needed things in their proper place. In the loft, she found hay. Not much, but enough to suggest Vernon had been maintaining at least a small operation. Feed bins held grain that was still good, and salt licks were stacked in one corner. All the infrastructure for keeping livestock, but no animals anywhere in sight. She saddled one of the horses she found in a small pasture behind the barn. 3 horses, actually, which surprised her, since she'd seen no sign of them the night before. They must have been in the trees beyond the creek. The mare she chose was a bay with kind eyes, older but sound. The horse accepted the saddle with the patience of an animal used to work, and when Elise swung up into the saddle, everything felt right, in a way nothing had felt right in years. The ranch spread out before her in a series of valleys and rolling pastures, all of it empty. She rode the fence lines, noting places where wire needed replacing and posts had rotted. Normal ranch work, the kind of thing that accumulated when a man got older and couldn't keep up the way he once had. But nothing unusual, nothing that explained Vernon's cryptic letter or the strange brand book sitting on his desk. She rode east first, toward the property line she shared with the nearest neighbor. Raymond had mentioned the name. Duncan Fairchild owned a successful operation that ran several hundred head of cattle and bred quarter horses. She could see his fence line in the distance, wire tight and posts straight. Everything maintained to a standard that made her own fence look shabby. A rider appeared on the other side of that fence, moving parallel to her course. He stopped when she stopped, and after a moment he rode closer. Elise guided her horse to the fence line and waited. The man was somewhere in his mid-40s, wearing a good hat and sitting a horse that probably cost more than her truck. He had the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors, but his clothes were too clean, his tack too new. He looked like a rancher who could afford to hire people to do the actual ranching. "You'd be Vernon's niece," he said. Not a question. Elise Crane. She didn't offer her hand across the fence. Something about his tone made her cautious. Duncan Fairchild. "I own the place east of here." He studied her for a moment, then looked past her toward Vernon's ranch buildings. "Sorry about your uncle." He kept to himself, but he was a fixture around here. "Thank you. You planning to work the place or sell it?" "Haven't decided yet." Duncan nodded slowly. "If you do decide to sell, I'd be interested in making an offer. Could combine it with my operation, make sense of both properties. I'll keep that in mind." "Your uncle and I didn't always see eye to eye," Duncan said. And there was something in his voice that made Elise pay closer attention. He had some peculiar ideas about things, made some accusations that weren't warranted. "What kind of accusations?" Duncan's jaw tightened. "Nothing that matters now. But if you're staying, you should know people around here value good neighbors. Folks who mind their own business and don't go looking for trouble. He touched his hat and rode off before she could respond, leaving her sitting on her side of the fence wondering what had just happened. It had felt like a warning, delivered politely but clearly. Stay out of whatever Vernon had been into, or there would be consequences. She rode back to the ranch house, thinking about that conversation. Vernon had made accusations against Duncan Fairchild. About what? And why would that matter now, months after Vernon's death? The sun was high when she returned, and she found a truck parked near the barn, an older pickup with Merrick Feed and Supply painted on the door. An elderly man stood near the barn, waiting with the patience of someone used to ranch time. "Help you?" Elise asked, dismounting. Gus Merrick. He was in his late 60s, maybe older, with a face that had seen every kind of weather Montana could produce. Ran the feed store in Coldwater for 40 years. Just wanted to stop by, pay my respects. Vernon was a customer of mine for longer than I care to count. That's kind of you. He was a good man. Gus looked around the property, his expression thoughtful. Placed his last order about 2 weeks before he passed. Big order, too. Hey, grain, supplements. More than usual. For what? Elise asked. There's no livestock here. Gus gave her a long look. That's what I wondered. Vernon said he was expecting to need it. Didn't say what for. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. He prepaid, but I never delivered. Seemed wrong to just leave it sitting at the store. If you want it, I'll bring it out. Elise took the envelope. It contained a receipt for nearly $800 worth of feed and supplies, dated 2 weeks before Vernon died. She looked up at Gus. Did my uncle say anything else? Anything that seemed odd? Vernon always seemed a little odd, if I'm being honest, especially these last few years. He'd come to town at strange hours, buy supplies, head right back out. Sometimes I'd see him driving through late at night, trailer behind his truck. Gus paused. He was doing something, that's for sure. But whatever it was, he kept it to himself. After Gus left, Elise stood in the yard holding the receipt and looking at the mountains rising behind the ranch. Vernon had been preparing for something. Buying feed for animals that didn't exist, at least not anywhere she could see. Making notes about brands from defunct ranches, writing cryptic letters about taking care of them. Somewhere on this property there were answers. And tomorrow she would start looking in earnest. Elise woke before dawn on her second full day at the ranch, pulled from sleep by something she couldn't name. The house was silent around her, but the feeling persisted, a sense that she was missing something obvious, something Vernon had left for her to find. She made coffee and watched the sky lighten, then made a decision. The ranch stretched back into the foothills for miles, much of it terrain she hadn't seen since she was a teenager. If Vernon had been hiding something, it would be back there where the land got rough and visitors never went. She saddled the bay mare again, filled a canteen and packed supplies into saddlebags. Rope, a knife, basic first aid, the kind of things you took when riding into remote country. The morning air was cold enough to make her breath visible, but the sky was clear, and the forecast called for good weather. If she was going to explore the back reaches of the property, today was the day to do it. The trail behind the ranch buildings followed the creek upstream, climbing gradually into terrain that got steeper and more wooded. She'd ridden this way as a girl, but memory was unreliable, and the land had changed. Trees had fallen, the trail had shifted, and after an hour she found herself navigating more by instinct than recognition. The mare moved steadily beneath her, sure-footed on the rocky ground. They crossed the creek twice, the water running fast and cold, with snowmelt from higher elevations. Elise watched for signs that Vernon had come this way recently. Hoofprints, broken branches, anything that suggested regular travel. For a long time she saw nothing. Then, nearly 2 hours into the ride, she found a place where multiple trails converged. The ground was churned from heavy use, grass worn away by repeated passage. Not just one horse, but many animals moving through regularly. Her heart rate picked up. She dismounted and studied the tracks more carefully. Cattle had been through here, and horses. Lots of them, and recently, within the last few weeks at most. The tracks led higher, following a narrow canyon that cut deeper into the mountains. She remounted and followed. The canyon walls rose on either side, rock faces weathered into fantastic shapes by centuries of wind and water. The trail narrowed until there was barely room for a horse to pass, then opened suddenly into something Elise hadn't expected. A hidden valley, maybe 30 acres, ringed by cliffs that made it invisible from any direction except the narrow passage she'd just navigated. Natural springs fed pools of clear water. Grass grew thick despite the elevation, and everywhere she looked there were animals. She stopped her horse and sat absolutely still, trying to comprehend what she was seeing. Horses grazed in small groups scattered across the valley floor. Cattle stood in the shade of stunted pines near the rock walls. A small herd of mules watched her from a distance, with the skeptical intelligence mules brought to everything. They were thin, most of them, not starving, but showing the effects of hard times. Several bore obvious signs of injury or neglect. Rope burns, poorly healed cuts, the kind of damage that came from rough handling or worse. She counted as best she could from where she sat. 50 horses at least, maybe 60. 40 or 50 cattle, a dozen mules, and probably more she couldn't see in the trees and shadows. Easily close to 200 animals, all hidden in this secret place that Vernon had somehow kept from everyone. Her hands were shaking. She made herself breathe slowly, made herself think. These animals hadn't appeared by magic. Vernon had brought them here, one by one or in small groups over months or years. He'd been feeding them, caring for them, keeping them alive in a place no one else knew about. But where had they come from? She dismounted and walked forward slowly, speaking softly to the nearest group of horses. They watched her approach with wariness, but not the blind panic of truly wild animals. These had been handled, at least at some point in their lives. They knew humans, even if they didn't necessarily trust them. A roan mare let her get close enough to see the brand on her shoulder, Circle T, clear as day despite the rough coat. Elise knew that brand. The Thompson Ranch had used it for 3 generations before going bankrupt 5 or 6 years ago. She'd heard the family lost everything in a foreclosure, moved away somewhere east. She moved through the herd, looking at brands. Broken Arrow, Ladder J Diamond Bar. Half a dozen others she recognized, all from ranches that had failed or been sold or simply vanished from the Montana landscape. These animals were ghosts from operations that no longer existed. Near the far end of the valley, she found a natural cave carved into the cliff face. Inside, protected from weather, Vernon had stored supplies. Hay and tarps, grain in sealed barrels, veterinary equipment, and tools. Everything organized with the same careful precision she'd seen in the barn at the main ranch. And hanging on a peg near the entrance, a bridle that made her breath catch. The bridle had 3 different ranch tags attached to it, each representing a different brand, a different owner. It was physical evidence of something too complex to be simple theft. Vernon hadn't just taken these animals. He'd collected them from multiple sources, probably over years, and hidden them here. Why? She walked back out into the sunlight and looked at the herd with new understanding. These weren't stolen horses in the conventional sense. They were survivors, animals that had been abandoned when ranches failed, or abused by owners who saw them as nothing more than property, or destined for slaughter when they became inconvenient. Vernon had taken them, hidden them, kept them alive, but that was still theft, no matter how noble the motivation. If anyone found out about this, if the authorities discovered nearly 200 animals bearing other people's brands hidden on her property, she would lose the ranch, probably face criminal charges, definitely destroy any chance of building a life here. She spent the rest of the day in the valley, moving among the animals, assessing their condition. Most needed medical attention of some kind. All needed regular feeding and better nutrition. The natural grass couldn't support this many animals long-term, not without supplementation. That explained Vernon's large feed order 2 weeks before his death. He'd been preparing to continue caring for them. In the cave, she found a small ledger, similar to the brand book at the ranch house. Vernon's handwriting filled the pages with dates, descriptions, and notes. Roan mare Circle T found starving near Thompson Place after foreclosure. Emma Thompson loved this horse, couldn't bear to see it go to auction. Another entry. Bay gelding, broken arrow, removed from owner refusing medical care. Broken leg set and healing, page after page of careful records. Not the notes of a thief, but the diary of someone trying to do right in a world where legal and moral didn't always align. The sun was starting to drop toward the western peaks when Elise realized she had a choice to make. And she had to make it quickly. Report what she'd found and let the law sort it out, which would mean these animals seized and probably sold at auction. Or keep Vernon's secret, take on the burden of caring for nearly 200 animals she had no legal right to, and risk everything if the truth came out. She stood in the middle of that hidden valley as long shadows stretched across the grass, and thought about the roan mare with the Circle T brand, thought about Vernon's letter telling her to take care of them, thought about her own life, empty of purpose for so long that she'd almost forgotten what purpose felt like. The mare approached her cautiously, close enough that Elise could see the scars on her neck where a rope had cut deep, close enough to see the way one ear was notched from some old injury, close enough to see that despite everything, the horse's eyes held something that looked like hope. Elise made her decision. She would keep the secret. She would care for these animals as Vernon had cared for them, and she would deal with the consequences when they came, because they would come. Secrets this big never stayed buried forever. She rode back to the ranch house in the gathering dark, her mind already working through the logistics. Feed, water, medical supplies, time, money, all things she didn't have enough of. But she would find a way. She had to, because Vernon had trusted her with this. And because those animals, whatever their legal status, deserved someone willing to fight for them, even if that fight cost her everything. 3 days passed in a blur of work that left Elise exhausted in ways she hadn't been since her teenage summers on this ranch. She woke before dawn each morning, loaded the truck with hay and grain from the supplies Gus Merrick had agreed to deliver, and drove as close to the hidden valley as the terrain allowed. Then came the hard part, transferring everything to the mare and leading a pack line up the narrow trail to where the animals waited. The work was methodical and never-ending. Check the water sources, making sure the natural springs were flowing clean. Distribute feed to areas where the animals had learned to gather. Walk through the herd looking for injuries, illness, or signs of distress. The roan mare she'd noticed first had become a touchstone. Each morning she made sure to check on that particular horse. And each morning the mare seemed a little less wary, a little more willing to accept Elise's presence, but it was the malnourished gelding that worried her most. He was a big horse, probably 17 hands, with a coat so rough and dull it was hard to tell what color he'd been originally. His ribs showed clearly, and he moved with the careful gait of an animal in pain. She'd found him standing alone near the cave, and when she approached he didn't run, just watched her with eyes that held no expectation of kindness. His brand was Ladder J, burned deep into his shoulder. She remembered that ranch vaguely. It had been north of here, run by a family named Jensen until sometime in the early 80s. The operation had collapsed in bankruptcy, she thought, though the details were fuzzy. This horse bore the scars of hard use, rope burns on his legs, a badly healed cut across his chest, and something wrong with his left front hoof that made him favor it constantly. She spent an hour with him that third morning, just sitting nearby and talking softly. Eventually he let her touch him, and she worked her hands carefully over his body, feeling for heat or swelling, checking the hoof that troubled him. What she found made her angry. A crack in the hoof wall that had never been properly treated, now infected and causing constant pain. With proper care it could heal, but it would take time and attention this horse probably hadn't received in years. She made a mental note to add veterinary supplies to her growing list of needs. The small stock Vernon had left in the cave wouldn't last long with nearly 200 animals requiring care. By mid-morning, she was back at the main ranch. And that's when she found the bolt cutters. They were lying near the entrance to the narrow canyon trail, half hidden in tall grass, old and rusted, with dried blood on the cutting edges. She picked them up carefully, turning them over in her hands. These were heavy-duty cutters, the kind used for cutting chain or heavy wire. The kind someone might use to cut through a locked gate or a reinforced fence. The blood bothered her. It was old, brown rather than red, but definitely blood. Had Vernon cut himself using these? Or had the blood come from something else? Wire cutting into an animal during transport, maybe. She carried the bolt cutters back to the barn and added them to the collection of evidence she was accumulating without quite meaning to. Vernon's brand book with its cryptic entries. The bridle with 3 ranch tags. Now these bolt cutters that suggested the animals hadn't simply wandered into that hidden valley on there, and the pieces were forming a picture she wasn't sure she wanted to see. Clearly, that afternoon she drove into Coldwater, needing supplies and knowing she couldn't avoid the town forever. The feed store was busy with the kind of midweek crowd that suggested ranching never stopped, regardless of what day it was. Gus Merrick stood behind the counter, and when he saw her, he nodded toward the back office. She waited while he finished with another customer, then followed him into the small office that smelled of coffee and paper and decades of ranch business. "You found them," Gus said without preamble. Elise felt her stomach drop.
Found what?
"Don't insult my intelligence, girl." Vernon was buying enough feed for a small herd, and buying it regular. He wasn't doing it for 3 saddle horses. Gus sat heavily in his chair. "I never asked him about it directly. Figured it was his business. But I knew. Did anyone else know?" "Duncan Fairchild suspected something. He asked me about Vernon's feed orders more than once. I told him I couldn't discuss customers' business." Gus looked at her with sharp eyes that had seen more than he probably talked about. "Duncan's been looking for Vernon's operation for years. Never could find it. I expect he'll start looking at you now. Why does Duncan care?" Gus was quiet for a moment. "There was a horse went missing from Duncan's place about 2 years back. Big bay stallion, valuable animal. Duncan reported it stolen. Sheriff investigated. Never found anything. But Duncan was convinced Vernon took it, did he? I couldn't say. But I will tell you that Duncan Fairchild treats his animals like equipment, uses them hard, and shows no mercy when they break. If Vernon did take that stallion, he probably had good reason. Elise bought the supplies she needed, feed, salt licks, basic veterinary items, and charged them to the ranch account that was dwindling faster than she wanted to think about. Gus loaded everything into her truck without comment, but before she left he put a hand on her arm. "Be careful," he said. What Vernon was doing, whether it was right or wrong, it was dangerous. People around here have long memories and strong feelings about property. She drove back to the ranch thinking about that word. Property. That's what the animals were legally. Property that belonged to someone, or had belonged to someone before ranches failed and families scattered. Property that could be seized, sold, or destroyed at an owner's whim, because the law protected ownership more than it protected life. Vernon had chosen mercy over law. Now she was making the same choice, and she was beginning to understand what it would cost. That evening she returned to Vernon's study and went through the brand book more carefully, cross-referencing entries with dates and notes. A pattern emerged that she should have seen earlier. The brands mostly belonged to ranches that had gone under between 1978 and 1981, a period when drought and economic downturn had devastated ranching across Montana. Families had lost everything. Livestock had been sold at auction for pennies on the dollar, or simply abandoned when owners couldn't afford to feed them. Vernon had been there somehow, collecting the ones that would have died otherwise. Hiding them, caring for them, keeping them alive when the world had decided they were worth less than the cost of a bullet. She found newspaper clippings tucked between pages of the ledger. Articles about livestock auctions, foreclosure sales, bankruptcy proceedings. One article featured a photo of a family standing in front of their ranch house while strangers loaded their cattle onto trucks. The Thompson family, the same name from the roan mare's brand. Vernon had circled their name in pencil. The articles painted a picture of a time when good people lost everything through no fault of their own. When animals that had been partners in working the land became nothing more than assets to be liquidated. When mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Vernon had found a way to afford it anyway. The phone rang just before midnight, startling her out of a half-sleep at Vernon's desk. She answered without thinking. "This is Duncan Fairchild." His voice was sharp even over the phone line. "I want to talk to you about some stock I've got reason to believe is on your property." Elise's heart hammered. "I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. I'll be by tomorrow afternoon. I suggest you be ready to cooperate with a proper inspection of your land." He hung up before she could respond. She sat in the dark study, holding a dead phone, and understood that her time for quiet preparation had just run out. Elise didn't sleep that night. She spent the hours before dawn pacing Vernon's study, trying to figure out how to handle Duncan Fairchild's promised visit. Let him onto the property and risk him finding the hidden valley? Refuse and confirm his suspicions? There were no good options, only variations of bad. When first light came, she was already dressed and drinking her third cup of coffee. Her body ached from the past week's work. Muscles she'd forgotten she had were making themselves known. But exhaustion was the least of her problems. She rode out to the valley one more time before Duncan could arrive, taking the fastest route, even though it meant pushing the mare harder than she liked. The animals were stirring when she reached them, moving toward the areas where she usually distributed feed. The routine she'd established was already teaching them to expect her, to trust that food would come. That trust felt like a weight on her chest. The malnourished gelding was lying down near the cave, and for a terrible moment she thought he'd died in the night. Then he raised his head and looked at her with those patient, suffering eyes. She knelt beside him and ran her hands over his rough coat, feeling his ribs too clearly beneath her fingers. He needed more than she could give him, with basic feed and water. He needed professional veterinary care, the kind that cost money and required bringing someone else into the secret. She left extra feed and filled all the water troughs, then rode back faster than was wise on that steep trail. Duncan would be coming, and she needed to be ready. But it wasn't Duncan who arrived first. A white truck with cold water veterinary services painted on the door pulled up to the barn just after 10 in the morning. An older woman climbed out, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to conserve energy over decades of physical work. She wore jeans, work boots, and a canvas jacket, and carried herself with the no-nonsense air of a person who'd seen everything at least twice. "You'd be Elise Crane," the woman said. "Not a question. I'm Pauline Moss. I was Vernon's veterinarian. I didn't call for a vet." "No, but you should have." Pauline looked at her with shrewd eyes. "I heard you've been buying veterinary supplies from Gus. Basic things, nothing too specialized. And you've been buying a lot of feed for a ranch that supposedly has no stock." Elise kept her expression neutral. "I'm just starting to build up the operation. That's one story." Pauline leaned against her truck. "Here's another one. Vernon called me regularly for years. Consultations, he called them. Never wanted me to come out here, always met me in town or at neutral locations. He'd describe symptoms, ask about treatments, buy medications through me rather than through normal channels. I don't know anything about that. He was treating a herd he couldn't let anyone see. I know that much. I never asked where the animals were, and he never told me. But I helped him keep them alive." Pauline pulled a business card from her pocket and held it out. "When you're ready to talk honestly, call me. Those animals are going to need more than feed and water. And you're going to need someone who understands what Vernon was doing, because whatever it was, you've inherited more than just the legal complications." She got back in her truck and left before Elise could form a response. An hour later, Duncan Fairchild arrived with 2 men in a sheriff's department vehicle. Sheriff Tom Brennan climbed out of the SUV, looking uncomfortable. He was in his early 50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his career dealing with rural Montana's particular brand of problems. He touched his hat to Elise. "Ma'am, Duncan here has filed a complaint about possible livestock theft. Says he has reason to believe some of his animals might be on your property." Brennan's tone was carefully neutral. "I need to ask your permission to look around." Duncan stood beside his truck with his arms crossed, looking satisfied. "I know Vernon had my bay stallion. That horse was worth $15,000. If it's dead, I want compensation. If it's alive, I want it back." Elise forced herself to stay calm. You're welcome to look around the main ranch buildings, Sheriff. But I've only been here a week. I'm still figuring out what I inherited. What about the backcountry? Duncan interrupted. Vernon spent a lot of time up in those hills. I want to search the whole property. That's 800 acres of rough terrain, Elise said. Some of it I haven't even seen myself yet. You're welcome to try, but it would take days. Sheriff Brennan looked between them, clearly wishing he was somewhere else. Tell you what, let me look around the immediate area. Barn, corrals, obvious pastures. If I find anything that needs further investigation, we'll take it from there. Fair enough? It wasn't fair, but it was better than having a full search party heading into the mountains. Elise nodded. She watched Sheriff Brennan inspect the barn, the empty corrals, the small pasture where her 3 saddle horses grazed. He was thorough, but not aggressive about it, treating it like a formality he had to complete. Duncan followed him, pointing out this and that, insisting there had to be more. Where's all the feed going? Duncan demanded. Gus said she's been buying enough for a dozen head, but there's only 3 horses here. Building up supplies before I buy stock, Elise said evenly. Seemed smarter than trying to feed animals I haven't purchased yet. Brennan finished his inspection and came back to where Elise waited. I don't see anything that warrants further investigation at this time. If you do acquire stock, Ms. Crane, make sure everything's properly documented and branded according to regulations. I will. Duncan's face reddened. This is ridiculous. Vernon was hiding something, and she's continuing whatever he started. I know it. Knowing and proving are different things, Duncan. Brennan's voice hardened slightly. You can't just go searching people's property on suspicion. If you have actual evidence of theft, bring it to me. Otherwise, we're done here. He drove away, leaving Duncan standing in the yard, looking at Elise with undisguised anger. Your uncle was a thief, Duncan said quietly. He took what was mine, and he poisoned plenty of other people against me with his lies about how I treat my animals. I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm watching you. One slip and I'll have the law down on you so fast you won't know what happened. After he left, Elise went into the house and found her hands shaking. She'd survived the first confrontation, but Duncan wasn't going to let it go. He'd keep pushing, keep watching, keep looking for the evidence he needed to destroy everything. She pulled out Pauline Moss's card and stared at it for a long time. The veterinarian knew something, maybe everything. She'd worked with Vernon, which meant she understood the stakes. But trusting anyone with this secret felt like stepping off a cliff. Still, the gelding lying in the hidden valley was dying slowly without proper care. The other animals needed medical attention she couldn't provide alone. And Duncan Fairchild was already suspicious enough to be dangerous. She picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card. Pauline answered on the second ring. Took you longer than I expected. I need to talk to you, Elise said. Somewhere private. Mel's Diner, 2 towns over. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Come alone and be ready to tell the truth. The line went dead. Elise hung up and looked out the window at the mountains that hid Vernon's secret. Tomorrow, she would stop pretending she could handle this alone. Tomorrow, she would trust someone with the truth and hope that trust didn't destroy everything. But tonight, she had to make one more trip to the valley to check on the animals that depended on her. Because whatever tomorrow brought, they still needed to be fed. Mel's Diner sat on a state highway between Coldwater and a town called Garrison. The kind of place that survived on coffee and breakfast served all day to people passing through. Elise arrived 15 minutes early and took a booth in the back where she could see the door. The waitress brought coffee without asking, and Elise wrapped her hands around the cup for warmth she didn't really need. Pauline arrived exactly at 8, slid into the booth across from her, and ordered coffee when the waitress appeared. They sat in silence until the waitress left. Then Pauline spoke. How many animals? Elise hesitated, then committed. Close to 200. Horses, cattle, mules, hidden in a valley about 2 hours' ride from the main ranch. Pauline's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. Respect, maybe, or shared understanding of burden. Vernon started with just a few. It grew over the years. Every time he heard about livestock being abandoned or mistreated, He'd find a way to get them out. Started to consume his whole life. Why didn't you stop him? Because he was doing the right thing in the wrong way. Pauline added sugar to her coffee, stirred it slowly. I've been a veterinarian in this region for 40 years. I've seen things that would make you sick. Animals left to starve when ranches go under. Horses worked until they break, then shot because they're not worth the cost of feed. Cattle beaten for not moving fast enough. The law calls it property management. I call it cruelty. But it's still illegal what Vernon did. It is. And what you're doing now is illegal too. Pauline looked at her directly. So we need to decide. Are you going to keep doing it, or are you going to turn those animals over to the authorities? What would happen if I did turn them over? They'd be seized as evidence, sorted by brand, and returned to legal owners if those owners can be found. Most can't. The ranches don't exist anymore. So they'd go to auction, sold for whatever price they can get. Some might go to good homes. Most won't. And the ones in bad shape? Pauline shook her head. They'd be put down or sold for slaughter because nobody wants to invest in rehabilitating damaged livestock. Elise thought about the malnourished gelding, the roan mare with the rope scars, the pregnant mare she'd noticed just yesterday. I can't let that happen. Then you need help and you need a plan. Vernon managed alone for years, but barely. He took out a loan 6 months before he died because he ran out of money. His health was failing. He knew he couldn't keep going much longer. That's why he left everything to you. What was his plan? Just keep hiding them forever? Pauline pulled a photograph from her jacket and laid it on the table. 4 men standing at a livestock auction, looking grim. Elise recognized Vernon immediately, younger but unmistakable. The others she didn't know. This was taken in 1976, Pauline said. Your uncle and 3 other ranchers who saw what was happening during the foreclosure crisis. They started a network, informal and completely illegal. When animals needed rescue, they'd coordinate. Vernon had the hidden valley, so he became the main shelter. The others helped with transport, funding, placing animals when they could. Where are they now? 2 are dead. The 3rd moved to Wyoming 10 years ago to be near his grandchildren. Vernon was the last one still active. Pauline tapped the photo. But they proved it could be done. For nearly 15 years, they saved hundreds of animals by stealing them, by refusing to let property law justify cruelty. There's a difference. Pauline pulled the photo back. I'm not saying it was legal. I'm saying it was necessary. And I'm telling you that if you're going to continue, you need to be smarter than Vernon was. You need documentation, even if it's manufactured. You need legal cover. And you need money. I don't have money. The ranch account is almost empty. I can help with the veterinary work on credit. You'll owe me, but we'll figure that out later. As for documentation, Pauline pulled out a folder she'd brought with her. These are bills of sale, transfer documents, registration papers, all carefully forged by someone who shall remain nameless. Fill in the details for any animal that can't be traced back to a legitimate owner, and you've got at least a paper trail if anyone investigates. Elise stared at the documents. This is fraud. Yes, it's also survival. Vernon tried to do it without any legal cover at all. It nearly destroyed him, and it destroyed his relationship with his own children. They found out what he was doing and wanted no part of it. Pauline pushed the folder across the table. You have 2 choices. Try to legitimize what you can, or lose everything, including the animals. There is no moral high ground here, only different kinds of compromise. The weight of the decision pressed on Elise like physical force. She thought about Duncan Fairchild watching her property, about Sheriff Brennan's careful neutrality that wouldn't last if real evidence appeared, about nearly 200 animals depending on choices she made in the next few minutes. How much will this cost? $3,000 for the documents. More if you need my veterinary services regularly, which you will. Pauline's expression softened slightly. I know you don't have it now. Like I said, we'll work something out. Vernon paid me when he could, and I kept helping when he couldn't. I'll do the same for you. Why? Because somebody has to. Pauline finished her coffee. And because I'm 64 years old, and I've spent my entire career trying to help animals within a system that treats them like machines. Sometimes you have to work outside the system if you want to actually do any good. Elise took the folder. Inside were blank forms that could become salvation or evidence of conspiracy. There's something else you should know. Duncan Fairchild claims Vernon stole his bay stallion. He's convinced the horse is on my property. Pauline's jaw tightened. The stallion is there. Vernon took it 2 years ago after I examined the animal and found signs of systematic abuse. Whip marks, malnutrition, a broken rib that had healed wrong. Duncan refused treatment, said the horse just needed discipline. Vernon waited until Duncan was out of town, cut through his fence, and took the horse. So Duncan's right. Vernon did steal from him. Vernon saved an animal from continued torture. There's a difference. Pauline stood. But you need to know that if Duncan ever finds that horse, he can prove ownership. The brand is registered to him, and there's no way to forge documents that would override that. After Pauline left, Elise sat alone in the booth and looked at the folder in front of her. Every choice ahead led to moral compromise. Keep the secret and commit fraud to protect the animals. Tell the truth and send them to likely death or continued abuse. There were no clean options. She thought about the gelding lying in the valley, about the trust she'd seen growing in the roan mare's eyes. Thought about Vernon spending years working in secret, sacrificing his family relationships and his financial security to do what he believed was right. She picked up the folder and left the diner. By the time she reached the ranch, she'd made her decision. She would use the forged documents. She would accept Pauline's help. She would become what Duncan Fairchild already believed she was, someone who valued animal welfare over property law. And if that made her a criminal in the eyes of the legal system, she would live with that consequence. Because some things mattered more than staying on the right side of a law that protected cruelty, as long as you owned what you were cruel to. The animals were waiting in the hidden valley. Tomorrow, she would start the long process of legitimizing what could be legitimized and protecting what couldn't. Tonight, she just needed to make sure they were fed and safe. But when she arrived at the ranch, she found she had a visitor waiting. A battered pickup truck sat near the barn, and a young man in worn work clothes stood beside it. He was maybe 30, lean and weathered, with the careful posture of someone who'd learned not to make sudden moves around livestock. When he saw her, he pulled off his hat. "Ma'am, name's Cole Winters. I'm looking for work. Heard you might be starting up operations here." Elise climbed out of her truck slowly, assessing. "Who told you that?" "Gus Merrick mentioned you'd been buying supplies. Small town, word gets around." Cole shifted his weight. "I've worked ranches all over this part of Montana. Good with horses, decent with cattle, don't mind hard work. I can give you references if you want them. Why aren't you working somewhere else?" Something flickered across Cole's face, old anger, carefully controlled. "Had some trouble with an employer a few years back. Made it hard to find steady work after." "What kind of trouble?" Cole met her eyes directly. "The kind where I reported things I shouldn't have ignored, and it cost me." "I'd rather not say more unless you're seriously considering hiring me." Elise studied him. She needed help desperately. The work of caring for the hidden herd was becoming impossible to manage alone. But bringing someone else into the situation meant another person who could discover the secret, another risk she couldn't fully control. "I can't pay much," she said finally. "Ranch is just getting started, money's tight. I'm not looking to get rich. Just need steady work and a place to stay. There's a bunkhouse here, isn't there?" There was. A small building behind the barn that Vernon had apparently never used. Elise had looked inside once and found it dusty but serviceable. "I can offer room and board plus minimum wage. Work would be general repairs to start. Fences, buildings, equipment. Eventually helping with livestock if I acquire any. That works for me." Something about the way he said it made her pause. "If I acquire any." He'd phrased it carefully, leaving room for what might already exist. She wondered what Gus had actually told him, and what Cole had figured out on his own. "You can start tomorrow," she said. "Bunkhouse needs cleaning out, but it's yours. I'll show you around the property, explain what needs doing." "Appreciate it, ma'am." Cole put his hat back on. "I'll get my things moved in this evening, if that's all right." After he drove off to collect his belongings, Elise stood in the yard, feeling the weight of one more decision added to the pile. Hiring Cole was either the smartest thing she could do or the mistake that would bring everything crashing down. Only time would tell which. Cole proved to be exactly what he'd claimed, a steady worker who asked few questions and kept his observations to himself. For the first week, he focused on the main ranch buildings, repairing fence sections near the house, replacing rotted boards in the barn, cleaning and organizing the equipment shed. He worked from dawn to dusk without complaint, ate the simple meals Elise provided, and retired to the bunkhouse each evening without trying to make conversation beyond what work required. But Elise noticed things. The way Cole's eyes tracked her movements when she left early each morning with supplies. The careful attention he paid to the feed inventory, surely noting that she was going through far more than 3 saddle horses required. The morning she came back with mud on her boots and horse sweat on her jeans, and caught him glancing at the mountains behind the ranch with an expression that suggested he was putting pieces together. She was working in Vernon's study 2 weeks after hiring Cole when she found the journal. It had been hidden in a false bottom of Vernon's desk drawer, the kind of simple concealment that only worked if you weren't looking for it. She'd been searching for property deeds and found, instead, a leather-bound book filled with her uncle's handwriting. The first entry was dated April 12, 1978. Took 3 horses today from the Morrison place. Bank foreclosed 2 weeks ago. Family moved away. Horses left in the pasture to starve. Nobody coming to feed them. Nobody caring what happens. Brought them to the valley. They're in bad shape, but they'll live. This isn't how I thought my life would go, but I can't stand by and watch them die when I have the means to help. Elise turned pages, reading entry after entry that documented Vernon's secret operation. The entries started hopeful, almost proud. Vernon rescuing animals that would otherwise perish, giving them a chance. But as the years progressed, the tone changed. Pride turned to doubt, doubt to guilt, guilt to something like desperation. An entry from 1981. Today I became what I fought against. A thief. Took the Patterson family's mare right out of their corral because I knew they were selling her to the slaughterhouse. She's pregnant. They didn't even notice. But I know what I did is wrong, regardless of the reason. How do you balance one wrong against another? Another from 1982, just months before Vernon's death. Can't keep going like this much longer. The money's running out. My health isn't what it was. Every time I ride to the valley, I wonder if I'll make it back. But what happens to them if I stop? Who else will do this? And finally, the entry that made Elise's hands shake, called Raymond today, updated my will. Everything goes to Elise. She's stronger than she knows. She'll understand. She'll do what's right, even when it's hard. I trust her more than I ever trusted my own children, who wanted no part of this. They called me a criminal and cut me off. Maybe they're right. But if Elise inherits this burden, at least the animals will have a chance. Elise closed the journal and sat in the quiet study, understanding finally why Vernon had chosen her. Not because she was family, but because he believed she had the moral courage to continue what he'd started. The weight of that trust was almost unbearable. She opened the journal again, reading more carefully. Vernon had kept detailed records, dates, descriptions, brands, and something else that caught her attention. Names of families he'd secretly helped. July 1979, returned the Thompson's bay mare anonymously. Left her in their new pasture with a note saying she'd been found wandering. Emma Thompson cried when she saw that horse. She'd thought it lost forever when the bank took their ranch. Couldn't stand seeing that family separated from an animal they loved. March 1980, the Ridley kids' pony. Parents lost everything. Had to move to town. Couldn't take the pony with them. I kept it safe for 2 years. When the family got back on their feet, the pony showed up in their yard. Never told them who returned it. Page after page of similar entries. Vernon hadn't just been hiding stolen livestock. He'd been running a secret sanctuary, protecting animals and then reuniting them with their families when possible. It was theft in service of compassion, illegal but driven by mercy rather than greed. Near the back of the journal, Elise found something that made her breath catch. Newspaper clippings tucked between pages, and among them an official document. County investigation, animal cruelty complaint, Duncan, Fairchild Ranch. The document was dated March 1980. Someone had filed a formal complaint alleging systematic mistreatment of livestock on Fairchild's property. The complaint included detailed observations, dates, specific incidents. It read like testimony from someone who'd worked there and witnessed everything firsthand, but stamped across the document in red ink. Investigation closed. Insufficient evidence. Vernon had written in the margin, political connections. The truth doesn't matter when you know the right people. Elise sat back, her mind racing. Someone had tried to stop Duncan Fairchild through legal channels, and the attempt had been shut down. Was that why Vernon had started taking more aggressive action? Had he lost faith in the system's ability to protect the animals? She was still sitting there when Cole knocked on the study door frame. She looked up startled. She hadn't heard him approach. "Sorry to interrupt," he said. "Just wanted to let you know I'm heading into town for supplies. Need anything?" Elise almost said no, then changed her mind. "Actually, can you wait a minute? I need to ask you something." Cole stepped into the study, and she saw his eyes go to the journal on the desk. She made a decision in that moment, a gamble, but one that felt necessary. "That trouble you mentioned when I hired you, did it involve Duncan Fairchild?" Cole's expression went carefully neutral. "Why do you ask?" "Because I found something that suggests someone filed a formal complaint against him in 1980. Someone who'd worked there and seen things that needed reporting." Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled up a chair and sat down, not quite meeting her eyes. "I was 23 years old, needed work, didn't ask too many questions. Fairchild hired me to help with his horse operation. Good pay, decent conditions for the employees anyway, but not for the animals." "Not for the animals," Cole agreed. "Horses overworked, underfed, beaten if they didn't perform. Medical care denied because it cost money. I watched a valuable stallion nearly die from an infected hoof because Fairchild wouldn't pay for a vet. Just said the horse would heal on its own or it wouldn't. You filed the complaint." "I did. Documented everything, dates, incidents, photos when I could get them. Thought if I presented enough evidence, the authorities would have to act." Cole's voice held old bitterness. "The investigation lasted 2 weeks. Then suddenly it was closed, deemed unfounded. Fairchild has a cousin on the county commission. He made some calls, applied some pressure, and that was that. What happened to you? Fired immediately. Word spread that I was a troublemaker, someone who turned on his employer. Couldn't find work anywhere in the county. Had to move around, take jobs where nobody knew the story." Cole looked at her directly. "That bay stallion I tried to save? It disappeared about 6 months later. Fairchild reported it stolen. I always wondered if someone finally did what I couldn't, got that horse out of there." Elise felt pieces clicking into place. Vernon's journal, the forged documents Pauline had provided, Cole appearing at exactly the moment she needed help. Nothing was coincidence. "Vernon took that horse," she said quietly. "It's still alive." Cole's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't look surprised. "I figured something like that. Your uncle had a reputation for being wherever livestock were suffering. Some people called him a thief. Others called him something different." "What did they call him?" "A guardian. Someone who did what the law wouldn't." Cole stood. "If you're asking whether I'll keep your confidence, the answer is yes. If you're asking whether I'll help with whatever your uncle started, the answer is also yes. I owe that much to every animal I couldn't save when I tried to do things the legal way." After Cole left, Elise returned to the journal, reading through the rest of Vernon's entries. The final one was dated just 3 days before his death. "Elise is coming home. I didn't tell her why I left everything to her. Didn't want to burden her before she was ready. But she'll figure it out. She'll find the valley, find the animals, and she'll have to decide whether to continue or let it all end. I pray she has the courage I did, and the wisdom I didn't. This work broke my family apart and consumed my life. But I'd do it again, because someone has to stand between cruelty and mercy. Someone has to refuse to accept that property rights matter more than suffering. I hope she understands. I trust that she will." Elise closed the journal and held it against her chest. Vernon had trusted her with more than property. He'd trusted her with a mission, a purpose, and the knowledge that doing right sometimes meant breaking laws that protected wrong. She understood now, and she knew what she had to do next. The next morning, Elise led Cole to the hidden valley. They rode out before dawn, moving through the quiet darkness with only starlight to guide them. Cole followed without questions, and when they reached the narrow canyon entrance, he dismounted and studied the trail with an expression that suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about Vernon Crane. "This is incredible," he said quietly. "Nobody would ever find this unless they knew exactly where to look." That was the point. They rode single file through the canyon, and when they emerged into the valley, Cole stopped his horse and sat completely still. The animals were stirring in the early light, horses moving toward the feeding areas, cattle gathering near the water, the small herd of mules watching from their usual spot near the rock wall. How many? Cole's voice was barely audible, close to 200. He rode forward slowly, and Elise watched him take in the scene. She saw the moment he spotted specific animals. His posture changed, his hands tightened on the reins. He dismounted near a group of horses and stood looking at a bay stallion that lifted its head and watched him approach. The stallion was magnificent despite the scars. Probably 16 hands, well-muscled even after 2 years of limited exercise, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that spoke of good breeding. Cole moved closer, speaking softly, and the horse allowed him within touching distance. "This is him," Cole said. "This is Fairchild's stallion. I'd know him anywhere. Vernon's journal confirms it. He took the horse in 1983, right after you filed your complaint." Cole ran his hands over the stallion's shoulder, finding the brand that marked the animal as Fairchild's property. "He's been here 2 years, safe and healthy. Better than he ever was on Fairchild's ranch." They spent the morning working through the herd, with Cole identifying animals and Elise taking notes. The gelding she'd been worried about looked slightly better. Pauline had visited the valley once and treated the infected hoof, though the horse still needed regular care. The pregnant mare was nearing her time, and Cole estimated she'd foal within the month. "You need more help," Cole said as they distributed feed. "One person can't manage this. Even 2 is stretching it, I know. But every person I bring in is another risk. There's risk in not having enough hands, too. What happens if you get hurt out here? Or if something urgent happens and you're alone?" It was a fair point, one Elise had been avoiding. She was about to respond when she heard something that froze them both. The sound of horses approaching through the canyon, multiple horses moving fast. Cole looked at her with alarm. "Were you expecting anyone?" "No." They mounted quickly and rode toward the canyon entrance, arriving just as 3 riders emerged into the valley. Duncan Fairchild sat on the lead horse, flanked by 2 men Elise didn't recognize. Behind them came Sheriff Brennan on his department horse, looking grim. Duncan's face lit with triumph when he saw the animals spread across the valley. "I knew it. I told you, Brennan. Vernon was hiding stock up here, and she's continuing it." Sheriff Brennan rode forward, his expression a mixture of resignation and duty. "Miss Crane, I need to ask you about these animals. Specifically about their ownership and documentation." Elise's mind raced. How had Duncan found the valley? They'd been so careful, never taking the same route twice, never leaving obvious trails. Then she saw one of Duncan's men holding a GPS unit and understood. They'd been tracking her movements, probably for days, waiting for her to lead them here. "These animals are under my care," Elise said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I'm in the process of documenting their ownership and establishing proper records." "That's convenient," Duncan said, "because I see at least one animal that belongs to me. That bay stallion," he pointed at the horse Cole had been examining, "was stolen from my property 2 years ago. Brands registered to me, and I have documentation to prove ownership." Sheriff Brennan dismounted and approached the stallion. The horse shied away from Duncan, but allowed Brennan to examine the brand. "It's the Fairchild brand, all right. Duncan, you filed a theft report on this animal in 1983. "I did. Value $15,000. I want it back, and I want her arrested for theft." "I didn't steal anything," Elise said. "I inherited this property and everything on it from my uncle. If there are ownership disputes, they need to be settled through proper legal channels. She's hiding stolen livestock, Duncan insisted. Look around. How many of these animals have brands from other ranches? I recognize at least a dozen that disappeared over the years. Cole spoke up for the first time. Sheriff, before you make any decisions, there's something you should know. I worked for Mr. Fairchild in 1980. I filed a formal complaint about animal abuse on his property, a complaint that was mysteriously closed despite substantial evidence. Duncan's face went dark. That's a lie. This man was a disgruntled employee who made false accusations. I have copies of my original report, Cole said calmly, including veterinary documentation of injuries and neglect. That stallion you're so eager to reclaim was nearly dead from an infected hoof you refused to treat. I have photos from before Vernon took him, and you can see his condition now. You tell me which situation was better for the animal. Sheriff Brennan held up a hand. Everyone slow down. This situation is more complicated than a simple theft report. He looked at Elise. Do you have documentation for any of these animals? Elise thought about the forged papers Pauline had provided, still sitting unused in her desk. Using them now would be committing fraud in front of law enforcement. Not using them meant admitting she had no legal claim to animals bearing other people's brands. Before she could answer, one of Duncan's men called out, "Sheriff, you need to see this." They followed him to the cave where Vernon had stored supplies. The man pointed to the bolt cutters Elise had found weeks ago, now sitting on a shelf with other tools. Those are professional-grade cutters. The kind you'd use to cut through chain-link fence or reinforced gates. Duncan seized on it immediately. Evidence of how Vernon got past security. Sheriff, this is clearly an organized theft operation. My stallion is here, stolen property is here, and tools used to commit theft are here. What more do you need? Brennan looked at the bolt cutters, then at Elise. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come to the station and answer some questions. And I'm going to have to secure this location as potential evidence. These animals need care, Elise said desperately. They need to be fed and watered. If you take them, I'm not taking them anywhere right now, but I can't let you continue accessing this location until we sort out the legal issues. Brennan's voice was firm, but not unkind. Duncan, I'm not returning any animals to you until proper hearings are held. If they were taken due to abuse concerns, that changes the legal situation. Abuse concerns from 10 years ago, Duncan snapped. That investigation was closed. There was no evidence. The investigation was shut down through political pressure, Cole said. Not because there was no evidence. And I can prove it. Sheriff Brennan looked between them all, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Here's what's going to happen. Nobody touches these animals until I get legal guidance. Miss Crane, you can arrange for someone to provide basic care under supervision. But you're not to remove any animals or disturb potential evidence. Duncan, your ownership claim will be reviewed, but it's not automatic just because you filed a report years ago. Cole, he turned to the younger man, I want to see everything you claim to have on that 1980 investigation. I have it all, Cole said. Report, photos, witness statements, veterinary records, everything that mysteriously disappeared from official files. Duncan's expression shifted from triumph to something more uncertain. Those records were destroyed as part of closing the investigation. Official records were destroyed, Cole agreed. I kept copies. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Elise saw Sheriff Brennan's posture change as he began to understand that this situation was far more complex than a simple theft case. This was about systematic abuse, cover-ups, and years of secrets finally coming to light. Everyone off this property until further notice, Brennan ordered. I'm calling in support, and we're going to do this by the book. Every animal gets documented, every brand gets traced, and every claim gets investigated properly. He looked at Duncan. That includes reopening inquiries into past complaints if there's evidence they were improperly closed. Duncan's face went pale. You can't. I can and I will. If there's evidence of corruption in past investigations, that's my responsibility to pursue. Brennan turned to Elise. You'll need to come with me. Bring any documentation you have." As they rode out of the valley, Elise looked back at the animals they were leaving behind. The roan mare stood watching, and Elise felt the weight of failure crushing down on her. She'd tried to protect them, and instead she'd led Duncan Fairchild right to them. But then she glanced at Cole, riding beside her with quiet determination, and at the GPS unit in Duncan's hand that had tracked their movements. This wasn't failure, this was exposure. The secret was out, and now everything would be decided in the open, where truth had at least a chance of mattering. Vernon had worked in shadows because he had no choice. Now his niece would fight in the light, and maybe that was what needed to happen all along. The sheriff's station in Coldwater was a small building attached to the county offices, with 2 holding cells that were rarely used, and an interview room that smelled of old coffee and paperwork. Elise sat across a metal table from Sheriff Brennan while he took her statement, writing everything down in careful longhand. "Start from when you inherited the property," he said. "Tell me everything." She did. The letter from the lawyer, finding the brand book, discovering the hidden valley. She told him about Vernon's journal and the entries documenting years of rescuing animals from abandonment and abuse. She showed him the forged documents Pauline had provided, admitting they were fraudulent, but explaining why she'd considered using them. Brennan listened without interrupting, his pen moving steadily across the page. When she finished, he sat back and rubbed his eyes. "This is a mess," he said quietly. "Legally speaking, you're in serious trouble. Possession of stolen property at minimum, possibly conspiracy, if we can prove you knew the animals were taken illegally. Duncan Fairchild is pushing for criminal charges. What about the abuse allegations?" "That's where it gets complicated. Cole Winters showed me his original complaint file, and I mean original, not the sanitized version that's in our official records. Someone went through and removed key documents, probably right around the time the investigation was closed." Brennan's expression was grim. "That suggests corruption, which I take very seriously. So what happens now?" "I've contacted the county attorney. There's going to be a hearing to determine the status of the animals and whether criminal charges are warranted. That hearing will include review of Cole's evidence about the 1980 investigation, which might reopen issues we thought were settled." He looked at her directly. "If it turns out Duncan Fairchild was abusing animals and used political connections to avoid consequences, that changes the legal landscape significantly. But that won't help with the other animals. The ones from ranches that went under years ago?" "No," Brennan admitted. "Those are still legally problematic. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "if we can establish that Vernon was operating a legitimate rescue operation, even if the methods were illegal, that might influence how the county attorney proceeds after the interview." Elise was released without charges pending the hearing. She walked out into late afternoon sunshine to find Cole waiting by her truck, along with someone she hadn't expected to see. Pauline Moss leaned against her veterinary truck, arms crossed, looking tired but determined. "Heard what happened. We need to talk." They drove to Pauline's clinic, a converted barn on the outskirts of town. Inside, among the examination tables and medical equipment, Pauline laid out a plan. "The hearing is in 3 days. We have that long to build a case that what Vernon did and what you've been continuing was rescue, not theft. That means documentation, witnesses, and evidence of the abuse these animals suffered before Vernon intervened. How do we do that in 3 days? We start with the families Vernon helped." Pauline pulled out a list of names from Vernon's journal. The Thompsons, the Ridleys, at least 6 other families who lost livestock during the foreclosure crisis and mysteriously got them back later. If they'll testify that Vernon returned their animals instead of keeping or selling them, it establishes his intent wasn't criminal. Cole spoke up. "I can provide detailed testimony about conditions on Fairchild's ranch and the cover-up of my investigation. But we need more than my word. We need corroboration." "There's someone," Pauline said slowly. "Henry Tibbs. He's been Fairchild's ranch manager for 20 years. He's seen everything Duncan's done, and he's kept private records. Why would he testify against his employer?" Because he's been wanting to for years, but needed protection first. If this hearing provides legal cover, he might be willing. Pauline looked between them. But asking him means putting his livelihood at risk. We need to be sure. That evening, they drove to Henry Tibbs's small house on the edge of Fairchild's property. He was a man in his 60s, weathered and careful, who looked at them through his screen door like they were selling something he didn't want. "I know who you are," he said to Elise. "You're Vernon's niece. And you—" he looked at Cole. "You're the one who filed that complaint years back." "We need your help," Cole said directly. "Duncan found the animals Vernon was protecting. There's going to be a hearing, and we need someone to testify about conditions on Fairchild's ranch." Henry's jaw tightened. "I've got a job, a pension coming. Speaking against Duncan means losing both. It also means stopping him from getting those animals back," Pauline said, "including the stallion you watched nearly die from neglect because Duncan wouldn't pay for treatment." Something flickered in Henry's eyes. Old guilt, maybe, or anger that had been building for decades. "You don't know what it's like watching that year after year, knowing it's wrong but needing the paycheck, needing the stability. I've got grandkids depending on me." "I understand," Elise said quietly. "My uncle kept his operation secret for years because he knew the cost of exposure. But eventually, he decided some things were worth the cost. Those animals are going to be seized and probably returned to Duncan unless someone with first-hand knowledge speaks up." Henry was silent for a long time. Then he opened the door. "Come in. I'll show you what I've got." Inside his modest living room, Henry pulled out a cardboard box from a closet. It contained notebooks, years of them, filled with dated entries, observations, and records of animal conditions on Fairchild's ranch. "I started keeping these after Cole got fired," Henry said. "Figured someone should document what was happening, even if I was too much of a coward to do anything about it. Every time Duncan refused medical care, every time I saw abuse, I wrote it down. Dates, specifics, everything." He handed one notebook to Cole, who opened it and read. His expression went dark. "This is exactly what I saw. But you have 10 years of additional evidence, more like 15. It's been going on my entire time there." Henry looked at them with something like relief mixed with dread. "If I testify I'm done at that ranch, Duncan will fire me and make sure I never work in this county again. Then we make sure the testimony matters," Pauline said. "We make sure it's heard by people who can actually do something about it." Over the next 2 days, they worked around the clock preparing for the hearing. Pauline contacted the families Vernon had helped, and one by one they agreed to appear. Emma Thompson, now in her 70s, cried when she heard about Vernon's death and immediately agreed to testify about the return of her beloved mare. The Ridley family, still struggling but stable, said they'd drive in from across the state to speak about the pony Vernon had protected for them. Cole organized his documentation from the 1980 investigation, creating a timeline that showed not just the abuse, but the systematic cover-up that followed. He found the names of veterinarians who'd been called but turned away, of other ranch hands who'd witnessed the same things but were too afraid to speak. Elise worked with a lawyer Pauline recommended, Victor Hayes, a semi-retired attorney in his late 60s who'd spent his career on animal welfare cases. He reviewed everything they had and laid out the strategy. "We're not going to win on legal technicalities," Victor said bluntly. "The animals were taken without permission, and that's theft under the law. What we can do is establish mitigating circumstances so compelling that the county attorney chooses not to prosecute, and the judge orders the animals placed under protective custody rather than returned to original owners." "Will that work?" "It's our best shot. We need to make this about animal welfare rather than property rights. We need to make Vernon Crane look like a protector rather than a thief. And we need to make Duncan Fairchild's operation look like exactly what it was: systematic abuse enabled by corruption." The night before the hearing, Elise drove out to the ranch and sat on Vernon's porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. She thought about her uncle sitting in this same spot, carrying the weight of his secret operation, knowing that Exposure would cost him everything, but continuing anyway, because the alternative was worse. She thought about the animals in the hidden valley, depending on humans to make decisions that would determine their fate. The roan mare with the rope scars, the malnourished gelding slowly recovering, the pregnant mare about to bring new life into a situation where safety was uncertain, the bay stallion that had survived 2 years of peace, but might be sent back to the man who'd nearly destroyed him. Tomorrow, everything would be decided in public. The secret Vernon had protected for years would be examined, judged, and ruled on by people who might not understand that sometimes the law and justice weren't the same thing. But at least it would be decided honestly, with all the facts presented and all the voices heard. That was more than Vernon had ever gotten. It was more than the animals had ever gotten. And if Elise lost everything in the process, at least she'd lose it fighting for something that mattered. She went inside and slept poorly, dreaming of courtrooms and corrals, of brands and bolt cutters, of her uncle riding through mountains she still couldn't quite see clearly. In the dream, he turned back and nodded once, and she understood he was proud of her. When morning came, she was ready. The county courthouse was a brick building from the 1920s, with high ceilings and wooden benches that had held generations of Montana residents seeking justice. By 9 in the morning, every seat was filled. Word had spread through Coldwater and beyond. This wasn't just about stolen livestock. It was about secrets that had been buried for years, finally coming to light. Judge Martha Whitestone presided, a woman in her late 60s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for fairness that had kept her elected for 3 decades. She looked over the crowded courtroom with an expression that suggested she understood. This hearing would be more complicated than the paperwork indicated. Duncan Fairchild sat at one table with his attorney, a sharp-dressed man from Billings who specialized in property law. Duncan wore his best suit and an expression of righteous anger. This was his moment. Vindication after years of suspicion. Proof that Vernon Crane had been the thief he'd always claimed. Elise sat at the other table with Victor Hayes, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Cole and Pauline sat directly behind her. Scattered through the audience, she recognized faces from Vernon's journal. The Thompson family, the Ridleys, others who'd come to speak about a man who'd helped them in secret. Judge Whitestone called the hearing to order. We're here to determine the status of approximately 200 animals currently located on the Crane Ranch property, and to address allegations of theft and related charges. Mr. Crawford, you represent the complainant? Duncan's attorney stood. Yes, Your Honor. My client, Duncan Fairchild, filed a theft report in 1983 regarding a valuable bay stallion. That animal has been located on Ms. Crane's property, along with numerous other livestock-bearing brands from various ranches. We're seeking immediate return of the stallion and criminal charges against Ms. Crane for receiving stolen property. Ms. Crane, you're represented by Mr. Hayes. Victor stood, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms. Yes, Your Honor. We acknowledge that animals bearing other parties' brands are present on my client's property. However, the circumstances surrounding how those animals came to be there are central to understanding the appropriate legal response. This isn't a simple theft case. It's a matter of animal welfare, systematic abuse, and the failure of proper authorities to address cruelty when it was reported through legal channels. Judge Whitestone leaned back. That's quite a claim, Mr. Hayes. I assume you have evidence. Substantial evidence, Your Honor. We have testimony from multiple witnesses, documentation of abuse spanning 15 years, and proof that previous investigations were improperly closed through political interference. Duncan's attorney objected immediately. Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the matter at hand. Whether Mr. Fairchild mistreated his animals, which we deny, has no bearing on the fact that his property was stolen. Actually, it has significant bearing. Victor replied calmly. If animals were removed from situations of active abuse and imminent danger, that establishes both motive and potential legal justification under animal protection statutes. Judge Whitestone considered this. I'll allow testimony regarding the condition and treatment of the animals, but let's establish the basic facts first. Mr. Crawford, present your evidence of ownership and theft. Duncan's attorney submitted the original theft report from 1983, registration papers for the bay stallion showing Duncan as owner, and photographs of the animal taken shortly before it disappeared. The brand on the stallion matches my client's registered brand. The animal was taken from a secured pasture without permission. That's theft by any definition. Mr. Hayes, does your client dispute that the stallion belonged to Mr. Fairchild? We don't dispute the original ownership. What we dispute is Mr. Fairchild's fitness to have the animal returned to him. Victor nodded to Cole, who stood. Your Honor, this is Cole Winters. In 1980, he filed a formal complaint alleging animal abuse on Mr. Fairchild's ranch. That complaint was investigated and then mysteriously closed. Mr. Winters maintained copies of all documentation, including evidence that was removed from official files. Judge Whitestone's expression sharpened with interest. Approach the bench, both of you. The attorneys moved forward, and there was quiet conversation that Elise couldn't hear. Then the judge looked at Sheriff Brennan, who sat near the front. Sheriff, were you aware of irregularities in the 1980 investigation? Brennan stood. Not until this week, Your Honor. I've reviewed Mr. Winters's files and compared them to our official records. Key documents are missing from our files, specifically veterinary reports and photographic evidence. This suggests someone removed them, likely around the time the investigation was closed. Who closed the investigation? The previous sheriff, now deceased. But there are notes suggesting pressure was applied by county officials. Brennan looked uncomfortable. I'm recommending a formal review of the handling of that case. Duncan's face had gone pale. His attorney leaned over and whispered urgently, but Duncan shook his head. Judge Whitestone returned her attention to the room. Mr. Winters, I want to hear your testimony, and I want to see this documentation you've maintained. Cole took the stand and was sworn in. Then, in careful detail, he described what he'd witnessed working on Fairchild's ranch. Horses denied medical care, animals beaten for not performing, the stallion with the infected hoof that Duncan refused to treat despite Cole's repeated requests. I documented everything, Cole said. Dates, incidents, photographs, when I could safely take them. I filed an official complaint with the Sheriff's Department providing all of this evidence. The investigation started, and I thought something would finally be done. Then suddenly it was closed, deemed unfounded. I was fired, blacklisted from work in the area, and all my evidence disappeared from official files. But you kept copies? I did, because I knew someday it might matter. Duncan's attorney cross-examined aggressively, trying to paint Cole as a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. But Cole's testimony remained steady, supported by meticulous documentation that was hard to dismiss as fabrication. Then Victor called Henry Tibbs. The courtroom stirred as Duncan's ranch manager took the stand. Duncan's expression shifted from pale to furious, but he couldn't stop what was coming. Henry testified about 15 years of witnessing abuse, about animals denied care, overworked, discarded when they became inconvenient, about Duncan's response when Henry suggested calling a veterinarian. That costs money. The animal will heal or it won't. Most damning of all, Henry produced his notebooks, years of dated entries, each one a careful record of suffering Duncan had allowed or caused. Why did you stay? Victor asked. I needed the job. I've got grandchildren, responsibilities, and I told myself that if I left, whoever replaced me might be worse. Henry's voice was heavy with regret. But the truth is, I was a coward. I watched animals suffer because speaking up would cost me something I wasn't willing to lose. What changed? Vernon Crane died, And I realized he'd spent years doing what I should have done, protecting animals when nobody else would. If his niece was willing to risk everything to continue that work, the least I could do was tell the truth. The courtroom was absolutely silent when Henry stepped down. Judge Whitestone called a brief recess, and when court resumed, Victor called his next witnesses. The families Vernon had helped. Emma Thompson took the stand first, a woman in her 70s who moved slowly but spoke with clarity. She told the story of losing her ranch in foreclosure, of watching strangers load her animals onto trucks while she stood helpless, of the bay mare her daughter had raised from a foal, gone forever, or so she'd thought. 3 months later, I woke up one morning and found her in our new pasture, just standing there like she'd never left. There was a note tied to her halter. She found her way home. No signature, no explanation. Emma's eyes filled with tears. I knew it was Vernon. He'd been at the foreclosure sale, watching everything. He must have bought her and kept her safe until we could take her back. Did you consider that theft? I considered it mercy. The law said that mare was bank property, to be sold to whoever bid highest. Vernon said she belonged with the family who loved her. He was right. The Ridley family testified next, telling a similar story about their daughter's pony. Then came others, a dozen families who'd lost animals in foreclosures or sales, only to have Vernon somehow return them when circumstances improved. Your Honor, Victor said Vernon Crane wasn't running a theft operation. He was running a sanctuary. He took animals that would have died or been abused, kept them safe and returned them when he could. Yes, it was illegal, but it was also the only option available when the legal system failed to protect animals from cruelty and abandonment. Duncan's attorney tried to counter. These are touching stories, but they don't change the fact that theft occurred. My client's stallion was taken without permission and held for 2 years. Property rights exist for a reason. We can't have people deciding for themselves when it's acceptable to take what belongs to others, even when what belongs to them is suffering. Victor's voice rose. Even when multiple complaints have been filed, evidence documented, and nothing was done because the owner had political connections. Judge Whitestone raised her hand. Gentlemen, I've heard enough. Let me be clear about something. This court does not condone theft, regardless of motivation. However, she looked directly at Duncan, this court also does not condone animal cruelty, and I'm deeply troubled by evidence suggesting previous investigations were improperly closed. She turned to Sheriff Brennan. Sheriff, I'm ordering a full review of the 1980 investigation and any related matters. If there's evidence of corruption or improper influence, I want it found and addressed. Yes, Your Honor. As for the animals currently on the Crane property, Judge Whitestone paused, clearly weighing her words carefully. I'm not prepared to order their immediate return to anyone. Mr. Crawford, your client's ownership of the bay stallion is documented, but given the testimony presented today, I have concerns about returning any animal to an environment where abuse may have occurred or may occur again. Duncan half rose from his seat. Your Honor, these allegations are unproven. I haven't been charged with anything. Not yet, the judge said pointedly. But based on what I've heard today, I'm ordering an immediate inspection of your ranch by a certified veterinary team. Any animals found in poor condition will be seized pending further proceedings. She returned her attention to Elise. Miss Crane, I'm placing the animals currently on your property under temporary protective custody. That means you maintain care of them, but you don't own them and you can't dispose of them. Regular inspections will occur to ensure proper care standards are met. What about the ones that can't be traced to current owners? Victor asked. Those will require individual determinations. Some may eventually be transferred to legitimate sanctuaries. Some may be sold at auction with proceeds going to offset care costs. And some, she looked at the documentation, of Vernon's careful returns, may be reunited with families who can prove prior ownership and demonstrate ability to provide proper care. She banged her gavel once. I'm also ordering the formation of a county animal welfare committee to review current livestock protection laws and recommend improvements. Mr. Winters, I'd like you to serve on that committee. Henry Tibbs, you as well if you're willing. I'm willing, Henry said quietly. This hearing is adjourned. I'll issue written findings within the week. But let me be clear, Judge Whitestone's voice hardened. If I find evidence of ongoing animal abuse on any property in this county, I will use every legal tool available to stop it. Property rights do not include the right to torture. The courtroom erupted in conversation as the judge left. Elise sat stunned, trying to process what had just happened. They hadn't won completely. The animals were still in legal limbo, and her own status was uncertain. But they hadn't lost either. The valley would remain under her care, at least for now. Duncan stormed out without looking at anyone, his attorney following. But before they reached the door, Sheriff Brennan intercepted them. Mr. Fairchild, I'll need you to make yourself available for the ranch inspection, and I strongly suggest you cooperate fully. Duncan's response was too quiet to hear, but his expression spoke volumes. Outside the courthouse, Cole and Pauline caught up with Elise. That went better than I expected, Pauline said. Protective custody isn't ownership, but it's a start. What happens now? Now we prove you can run a legitimate sanctuary. We get proper licensing, we establish care protocols, and we document everything. Victor joined them, looking satisfied. The judge gave us a chance. Now we have to show we deserve it. Emma Thompson approached, moving carefully with a cane. She took Elise's hands in hers. Your uncle was a good man. He gave me back something I thought was lost forever. Thank you for continuing his work. I don't know if I can, Elise admitted. The costs, the regulations, everything that needs to be done, you'll figure it out, Emma said firmly. Vernon trusted you with this. That means something. As they walked to their vehicles, Elise looked back at the courthouse. Inside those walls, Vernon's secret had been judged and found, not innocent exactly, but understood. His illegal actions had been weighed against the suffering they prevented, and justice had proven more complex than simple property law. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time since finding the hidden valley, Elise felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward that didn't end in losing everything. 3 months later, on a clear September morning, Elise stood on Vernon's porch, her porch now, and watched the sun rise over what had officially become the Crane Wildlife Sanctuary. The transformation had been remarkable. The county's protective custody order had given her breathing room, and the community's response had provided the resources to make the sanctuary legitimate. Donations came in from people who'd heard the story. Some substantial, most modest, all given by folks who believed animals deserved protection. Gus Merrick had quietly organized a fundraising effort through his feed store, and the response surprised everyone. The ranch buildings showed the changes most clearly. The barn had been repaired and expanded, with new stalls and a veterinary treatment area, where Pauline now worked 2 days a week. The corrals were rebuilt to proper standards, and the pastures near the house were being used to rehabilitate animals that needed extra attention before returning to the hidden valley. That valley remained the heart of the operation, but it was no longer hidden. The county inspectors had seen it, documented it, and approved the care standards Elise had established. The animals were thriving, properly fed, medically attended, safe from the abuse that had marked so many of their earlier lives. The malnourished gelding she'd worried about those first weeks had made a full recovery. His coat gleamed now, and he moved without the painful limp that had marked him. He'd been officially transferred to the sanctuary after his original owner, a rancher who'd gone bankrupt in 1981, signed papers saying he had no desire to reclaim an animal he'd abandoned years ago. The roan mare with the rope scars had been reunited with Emma Thompson's family just last week. Emma's granddaughter had cried when she saw the horse her grandmother had loved, and Elise had felt Vernon's presence in that moment. His mission fulfilled in the way he'd always intended. The pregnant mare had foaled in early summer, producing a strong colt that now followed his mother through the valley with the unsteady confidence of youth. That colt represented everything the sanctuary was meant to be: new life given a chance, protected from the harsh economics that treated animals as disposable assets. As for Duncan Fairchild's bay stallion, that situation had been resolved by the judge herself. After the ranch inspection revealed multiple animals in poor condition and clear evidence of neglect, Judge Whitestone had ordered the stallion permanently transferred to sanctuary. Custody, Duncan had lost more than one. Horse, he'd lost his position of authority in the community and faced ongoing investigations into his ranching practices. The inspections of his property had led to criminal charges, and while those cases were still pending, Duncan had quietly put his ranch up for sale. Some people felt satisfaction at his downfall. Elise mostly felt sadness that it had taken so long for the truth to matter. Cole had become the sanctuary's first official employee, with a salary that was modest but steady. He lived in the bunkhouse and worked alongside Elise from dawn to dusk, managing the daily care of nearly 200 animals. The work was hard, but Cole had told her more than once that this was the first job since his complaint against Fairchild where he felt like he was making a real difference. Henry Tibbs had left Fairchild's employment and now worked part-time at the sanctuary. His pension supplemented by the hourly wage Elise could afford. He brought decades of ranching knowledge and a commitment to doing right that had come too late for some animals, but not too late to matter. The County Animal Welfare Committee had met monthly since the hearing, with Cole and Henry as active members. They were drafting new regulations, stronger protections for livestock, better reporting mechanisms for abuse, and provisions for emergency seizure when animals were in immediate danger. The regulations wouldn't bring back the ones Vernon couldn't save, but they might prevent future suffering. Elise walked down to the barn where Pauline was, examining a new arrival, a horse, rescued from abandonment by a rancher who'd heard about the sanctuary and called instead of leaving the animal to starve. That phone call represented something Vernon had never achieved, a legitimate way for people to help animals in crisis. "How's she look?" Elise asked. "Malnourished, dehydrated, but nothing we can't fix." Pauline ran expert hands over the horse's legs. "She'll need a few months of good care, but she'll make it. We've got room. You've got more than room. You've got a mission." Pauline straightened. "Vernon would be proud of what you've built here." This is what he wanted. His work continuing, but in the light instead of the shadows. That afternoon, Elise rode out to the valley one more time, taking the trail that had once been a secret path and was now an established route. The animals grazed peacefully, secure in their protected space. She found the roan mare she'd first noticed months ago, or rather, a different roan mare, since the original had gone home to the Thompsons. This new one bore similar scars, but showed the same gradual trust, the same slow acceptance that humans could mean safety instead of pain. She thought about Vernon making this same ride for years, carrying the burden alone, never knowing if anyone would understand or continue his work. The letter he'd left her sat in her desk at the ranch house, creased from multiple readings. "I trust you to do what's right." She'd done her best. The sanctuary wasn't perfect. Money was always tight, regulations were complicated, and there were still animals they couldn't save. But it was legitimate, legal, and growing. The ranchers were calling now, asking about taking in animals they couldn't care for. The model Vernon had developed in secret was becoming something that could operate in daylight, with community support instead of community suspicion. As the sun dropped toward the western peaks, painting the valley in gold and shadow, Elise felt something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. Not the vague sense that life should mean something, but the concrete knowledge that her work mattered. That every animal in this valley was alive because Vernon had refused to accept that property law justified cruelty. And because she'd chosen to continue what he started, she rode back to the ranch house as darkness fell, the mountains standing solid against the stars. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more difficult decisions about animals and resources, and the complicated intersection of law and mercy. But tonight, she could sit on the porch Vernon had built and know that his legacy was secure. The animals were safe. The work continued. And sometimes, when the wind was right, she could almost hear her uncle's voice in the rustling grass. Well done! The Crane Wildlife Sanctuary would stand. And that was enough.